The silence was the first gift they gave her. It arrived the moment the front door clicked shut, a heavy, sound-absorbing presence that settled over the house like a shroud. For a full year since Richard's death, this silence had been her most constant companion. It lived in the dust motes, dancing in the afternoon sun, in the cold leather of her husband's empty armchair, in the space between her own heartbeats. At 75, Elizabeth had learned that loneliness wasn't an absence of people, but an abundance of quiet. But today, the silence felt different. It felt like a countdown. On the polished mahogany coffee table, a single, beautifully wrapped gift sat like a jewel in the center of the vast, pristine living room. The paper was thick, creamy, with a pattern of golden leaves. The bow was a perfect, intricate knot of satin ribbon. It was a testament to her daughter-in-law, Sarah's impeccable taste. Everything about Sarah was impeccable. The memory of their visit, just minutes ago, was already replaying in her mind a film strip she'd seen too many times. Michael, her son, with his father's solid build and his own anxious eyes, had stood by the mantelpiece, hands in his pockets, rocking on his heels. "Happy Mother's Day, Mom." Sarah had swept in all Chanel No. 5 and dazzling white teeth pressing a cool, smooth cheek against Elizabeth's. "We wanted to give you something truly special this year. You deserve a break. You deserve to be pampered." Chloe, her daughter, had hovered by the door, a ghost in a floral dress. She had her mother's features, but wore them with a permanent apology. She'd clutched her purse with both hands, offering a watery smile. "We all think so, Mom. You do so much. What exactly did she do?" She watered the plants. She made sure the cleaning service had the right code. She existed within the four walls of the house. Richard had built a monument to a life that was no longer hers. "Go on, open it." Sarah had urged, her voice a little too bright, a little too loud for the cavernous room. Elizabeth's fingers, stiff with age, had fumbled with the perfect bow. Inside, nestled in tissue paper, was a stiff, cream-colored card. Embossed in gold script were the words, "Serenity Pines, Luxury Spa and Retreat." It was a gift certificate for the ultimate indulgence package. A full day of massages, facials, and catered lunch. It looked impossibly expensive. Wow! Elizabeth had breathed, genuinely touched for a fleeting second. The flicker of warmth was a foreign feeling. "Oh, children, you shouldn't have." "Nonsense," Michael said, finally coming to life. He used the same tone he used when explaining why he'd taken over her online banking. A firm, patient, patronizing tone. "It's all taken care of. You just have to call and book the appointment. The number's on the back. We wanted you to have a day that's just about you." Sarah had placed a hand on Michael's arm, a gesture of solidarity. "We'd take you ourselves, of course, but things are just insane right now. You know how it is. And Ava has that big tournament." Chloe had nodded in frantic agreement. So insane. They'd hugged her, then, one by one. Michael's hug was brief and dutiful. Sarah's was a rustle of expensive fabric and a whisper of, "We love you." Chloe's was tight, desperate, and over in a second, as if she couldn't bear the contact. And then they were gone. The roar of their SUV faded down the long driveway, and the silence rushed back in. Now, Elizabeth sat the heavy card in her hand. Serenity Pines. She'd heard of it. It was new, exclusive, nestled in the hills an hour away. A place for the wives of tech millionaires and Portland socialites. It wasn't her world. It had never been her world. Richard's money had bought them this house, this life, but it had never bought them entry. It had only bought them isolation. A strange, cold prickle of unease traced its way up her spine. It was the same feeling she'd had when Michael installed the new smart security system, complete with cameras in the main living areas. "For your safety, Mum," he'd said, "so we can make sure you're okay." It was the same feeling she'd had when her credit card was declined at the grocery store, only to have Sarah call her 5 minutes later, her voice laced with pity. "Oh, Elizabeth, you must have forgotten. Michael handles all the bills now. Just use the debit card he gave you. It's simpler, safer, pampered." The words were a cage, and the bars were forged from their loving concern. She looked at the voucher again. The paper was high quality, the printing crisp. But something was off, a small nagging detail. Richard had been an architect of not just buildings, but of systems of details. He had been a meticulous, obsessive man, and he'd passed that trait on to his son. Michael did not make careless mistakes. Ever. With a resolve that surprised her, Elizabeth picked up the cordless phone from its cradle. Her hand was steady. She dialed the number on the back of the card, her heart, a slow, heavy drum, against her ribs. The phone rang twice. "Serenity Pines, this is Amber speaking. How may I help you find your peace today?" The voice was smooth, professional, and real. Elizabeth's own voice felt rusty. "Hello? I'd like to book an appointment. I have a gift certificate." "Wonderful," Amber chirped. "I can certainly help you with that. Could you please give me the voucher number? It should be on the bottom right." Elizabeth read out the 16-digit code. She heard the soft clicking of a keyboard on the other end of the line. A pause. More clicking. The silence stretched. Ma'am Amber's voice was hesitant now. "Could you read that number to me one more time?" Elizabeth repeated it, her throat suddenly dry. Another long pause. This time, when the receptionist spoke, the professional polish was gone, replaced by a careful, almost apologetic tone. "I'm very sorry, ma'am, but I can't find any record of that voucher number. We have a very specific sequence we use. This number, it doesn't match our system. Are you sure it's from Serenity Pines?" The floor seemed to drop out from under her. The pristine living room, with its tasteful beige walls and expensive art, suddenly felt like a movie set. A stage for a play where she was the only one who didn't know her lines. "Yes," Elizabeth said, her voice a thin thread. "It says so, right here." "I see," Amber said the words heavy with a disbelief she was trying to hide. "Well, perhaps there was a printing error. If you'd like to come in, we can try to sort it out. But I can't make a booking with this number. It's not valid. Not valid." The words echoed in the suffocating silence after she'd hung up the phone. Not valid. Fake. A lie printed on expensive paper. A cold dread, sharp and acidic, washed through her. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't Michael being forgetful, or Sarah picking up a faulty gift. This was calculated. The beautiful wrapping, the expensive cardstock, the performance of loving concern, it was all part of the architecture of the lie. They had gone to great lengths to build a beautiful empty box and present it to her with a smile. Why? The question was a physical blow. Why the cruelty? Why the elaborate deception? It would have been kinder to give her nothing at all, to simply not show up. But that wasn't the point. The point was the performance. The point was to hand her a symbol of their care and affection, knowing it was worthless. It was a message. You are not worth the money. You are not worth the time. You are only worth the lie. The humiliation was a hot, creeping thing crawling up her neck. She felt a phantom audience watching her, laughing at the old fool who had believed her children loved her. For a long, long time, she just sat there, the fake voucher lying on the table, a monument to their contempt. The house was no longer just quiet. It was empty, and she was utterly, terrifyingly alone. The afternoon bled into a grey, listless evening. Elizabeth didn't move from the chair. She didn't eat. The beautiful gift sat on the table, mocking her. The hours stretched, each one a fresh wave of shame and confusion. Was she losing her mind? Was this some elaborate misunderstanding? Her mind, which her children so often reminded her was becoming unreliable, circled the facts again and again. The perfect printing, the professional receptionist, the meticulous nature of her son. The pieces didn't fit unless the puzzle itself was a picture of pure malice. Her tablet a gift from them last Christmas, so we can video chat and see your lovely face. Mom lay on the end table. She rarely used it, finding the bright screen and endless notifications overwhelming. But now, propelled by a morbid curiosity she couldn't name, she picked it up. Her thumb wrinkled and unsure tapped on the colourful icon for Instagram. She followed only a handful of accounts, a gardening blogger page for golden retriever puppies, and her daughter-in-law, Sarah. Sarah's profile was a curated masterpiece of domestic bliss. Sun-drenched photos of her children, Ava and Leo, playing in a flawlessly manicured backyard. Artistic shots of lattes and avocado toast. Beaming selfies with Michael, accompanied by captions that dripped with hashtags like "All blessed, cho family first, cho making memories." A new post was at the top of the feed. It had been uploaded 3 hours ago. The picture hit Elizabeth like a physical punch to the gut. It was Michael, Sarah, and a resentful-looking Chloe squinting in the sun. Behind them, her grandchildren, 16-year-old Ava and 12-year-old Leo, were mid-splash in a shimmering, impossibly blue swimming pool. Palm trees dotted the background. It was a scene of idyllic, carefree fun, a perfect family portrait. Elizabeth's eyes darted to the location tag at the top of the post. Blackwood Mountain Resort, Blackwood. The most exclusive, most expensive resort within a 5-hour drive. The place you went to be seen. A weekend there cost more than Elizabeth's entire monthly pension. It was 2 hours away. 2 hours in the opposite direction of the fictional Serenity Pines. Her breath hitched. Her gaze fell to the caption beneath the photo. The words written in Sarah's breezy, performative style seemed to burn on the screen. Family time is the best time. A much-needed weekend getaway to recharge the batteries. Thinking of Mom enjoying her well-deserved spa day, we miss you. Family. Blessed. Mother's Day love. The lie was breathtaking in its audacity. It wasn't just a private cruelty anymore. It was a public broadcast, a performance for their hundreds of followers, for their friends, for the entire world they had built for themselves. They hadn't just abandoned her on Mother's Day. They hadn't just given her a fake gift. They had used her. They had weaponized her. She was a prop, an alibi. The sweet, elderly mother blissfully enjoying a spa day, providing cover for their luxurious escape. The thought of their friends seeing the post, liking it, commenting, "Oh, so sweet of you," made her stomach turn. The humiliation she had felt earlier was nothing compared to this. This was a deeper, more profound violation. It was a public erasure. They had constructed a narrative for her, a pleasant fiction to paper over the inconvenient truth of her existence. In their perfect Instagrammable life, there was no room for a lonely old woman in a silent house. So they invented a new one, a pampered, cherished mother, happily out of sight and out of mind. She stared at the photo, at their smiling faces. Michael's smile didn't quite reach his eyes. Sarah's was wide, triumphant. Chloe looked like she wanted to be anywhere else. And Ava, her granddaughter Ava, who she adored, had a strained look on her face, a tension in her shoulders that didn't belong on a teenager by a resort pool. Something inside Elizabeth, something that had been dormant for decades, began to shift. The years of quiet submission, of being managed and placated and gently dismissed, began to burn away. The shame and confusion curdled, then hardened into something cold, solid, and heavy. It was resolve. She knew with a sudden, startling clarity that this was not the first lie. It was simply the first one she had been forced to see. Her life, this house, her relationship with her children, it was all a facade as carefully constructed as Sarah's Instagram feed. And her husband, Richard, He had been the original architect. They would be gone for 2 days. The post said, "Weekend getaway." 48 hours. They had given her a gift after all. Not a spa day, but a window. An opportunity. A crack in the gilded cage. She set the tablet down on the coffee table, its screen still glowing with their smiling, treacherous faces. She stood up. Her joints ached, but her spine felt straighter than it had in years. The silence of the house was no longer oppressive. It was a strategic advantage. The loneliness was no longer a weakness. It was freedom. Her gaze swept across the living room, the house she had lived in for 45 years, but had never truly seen. It wasn't a home. It was a museum of a life she hadn't chosen, filled with objects Richard had selected, a floor plan he had designed, a cage he had built. And after he died, his children had simply taken his place as the keepers. Her eyes landed on the hallway that led toward the back of the house, toward Richard's old study and the door to the basement. The basement, it was the one place in the house that had always been forbidden territory. When Richard was alive, he kept it locked with a heavy deadbolt. Sensitive work documents, Elizabeth, he'd say, tapping his temple. Trade secrets. And with your memory these days, we can't be too careful. He'd always said it with a gentle smile, as if his lack of trust was a form of protection. After he died, Michael had reinforced the rule. He'd arrived one afternoon with a toolbox and a brand new high-security lock. Just a precaution, Mum, he'd explained, not meeting her eyes as he drilled into the old wood. The basement is full of junk, steep stairs. It's for your own safety. I don't want you taking a tumble. Her safety, her forgetfulness, her frailty. They were the reasons for everything. The reason she couldn't manage her own money. The reason she needed cameras watching her. The reason she couldn't be trusted with a simple basement door. Now those words echoed with a sinister new meaning. What was in that basement that was so dangerous? What secrets were they protecting? Not trade secrets. Richard's firm had dissolved upon his death. It wasn't just junk. If it were junk, Michael would have hired someone to clear it out. He was ruthlessly efficient that way. No, they were hiding something. Something that started with Richard and was now being guarded by his son. Elizabeth began to walk her steps deliberate on the thick Persian rug. She passed the gallery of family photos on the wall, weddings, graduations, holidays, a timeline of manufactured happiness. She didn't spare them a glance. Her destination was the study. Richard's study was his sanctuary, and it had been left almost untouched, a shrine to the man he had been. Leather-bound books he'd never read lined the shelves. His heavy oak desk was clear, save for a single ornate penholder. And on the corner of the desk, glowering out at the room, was a heavy bronze statue of St. Christopher, the patron saint of travellers. It had been a gift from his own father, a man Elizabeth had never liked. Richard was not a religious man. He was a man of logic, systems, and secrets. But he was also a creature of profound, unshakable habit. And as Elizabeth stood in the doorway of the silent room, a memory buried for decades under layers of grief and gaslighting surfaced with the force of a revelation. It was from 30 years ago. A rare, violent thunderstorm had knocked out the power. Richard had been frantic not about the lights, but about the security system which had failed. He was pacing, agitated, checking all the locks. She'd asked him what would happen if he ever lost his keys if they were locked out. He had stopped pacing and given her a condescending smile. "I am never locked out, Elizabeth. There is always a failsafe, a master key. You just have to know where to look." He had picked up the St. Christopher statue. People only ever see the surface. They never think to look underneath. She'd forgotten it instantly, dismissing it as more of his pompous pronouncements. But now the memory was a beacon. Her heart began to pound a frantic, hopeful rhythm against her ribs. She walked to the desk. The statue was cold and heavy, much heavier than she expected. It took all her strength to lift it. Her arms trembled with the strain. For a moment, she thought she would drop it, that it would crash onto the hardwood floor, and her chance would be lost. But she gritted her teeth, her resolve afire in her belly, and slid it carefully across the polished wood. She turned it over. The base was covered in green felt, worn and dusty with age. Her fingers, gnarled but determined, picked at the edge of the felt. It peeled back with a soft tearing sound, and there it was. Taped securely into a shallow, hollowed-out space in the bronze was a single old-fashioned skeleton key. It was heavy, made of brass, and tarnished with age. It wasn't a key for a modern lock. It was a master key. Richard's fail-safe. She clutched it in her palm, the cold metal a shock against her skin. It felt like a weapon. It felt like power. For the first time in a very, very long time, she was holding something that belonged only to her. Her breath came in ragged gasps as she carried her discovery out of the study and down the hall. The new, shiny lock on the basement door seemed to gleam mockingly under the hallway light. Michael's lock, a symbol of his control. But below it was the original keyhole, the one that matched the key in her hand. With a hand that trembled, not from age, but from a terrifying, exhilarating mixture of fear and anticipation, she slid the brass key into the lock. It fit perfectly. She turned it. The mechanism inside, unused for years, resisted for a moment and then gave way with a loud, grating clunk that seemed to echo through the entire silent house. She pulled the key out and reached for the doorknob. This was the point of no return. Opening this door was an act of defiance. It was a declaration of war against the loving, careful narrative her children had built around her. It was a betrayal of her husband's memory, or at least the memory she was supposed to have. She hesitated, her hand on the cold brass. What if they were right? What if she was just a confused old woman imagining conspiracies? What if she opened the door and found nothing but dusty boxes and spiders? The shame would be unbearable. Then she thought of the smiling faces by the resort pool. She thought of the caption, "Thinking of Mom, enjoying her well-deserved spa day." The humiliation hardened once more into steel. She was not confused. She was not imagining things. She had been lied to, publicly and cruelly. And the reason for that lie was somewhere behind this door. She turned the knob. The door swung inward with a low, mournful creak, revealing a flight of steep wooden stairs descending into absolute, impenetrable darkness. A gust of cold, stale air rushed up to meet her, carrying the scent of damp earth dust and something else. The smell of secrets left to rot. Elizabeth stood at the precipice, the key still warm in her hand, and stared down into the abyss. She had no idea what she would find, but she knew one thing for certain. The woman who walked down those stairs would not be the same one who came back up. The gilded cage was open, and she was finally terrifyingly free. The air in the basement was wrong. It wasn't the smell of damp earth and forgotten things of mothballs and decaying paper. It was the sterile scent of ozone, the faint electric hum of machinery working in the dark. It smelled clean. Too clean. The single bare bulb she'd switched on revealed not a cluttered storage space, but an office. It was stark cold and meticulously organized. Along one wall stood a long black desk. On it sat a computer tower, a sleek, menacing monolith with a soft blue light pulsing from its core, connected to 3 wide, dark monitors. It was the kind of machine she'd seen in movies about hackers, not something that belonged in the foundation of her quiet suburban home. She walked towards it, her hand trailing along the cool metal surface of a filing cabinet. She tried the handle. Locked. Of course. She sat in the expensive-looking ergonomic chair before the computer, the leather sighing under her weight. She moved the mouse. The three screens flickered to life, displaying a single demanding field on a black background password. A blinking cursor was the only sign of life. She typed, Richard. Access denied. She tried Michael. Access denied. She tried Elizabeth, her own name feeling foreign and useless. Access denied. She tried birthdays, anniversaries, the name of their first dog. Nothing. It was a digital fortress, and she was on the outside. She pushed away from the desk, a cold dread seeping into her bones, more chilling than the basement air. This wasn't just about a locked room anymore. This was about a locked life. She looked around her eyes, adjusting, seeing things she'd missed. A high-end printer and scanner, a paper shredder that looked industrial grade, and in the far corner, mounted near the ceiling, a small black dome with a single unblinking lens. A security camera. Here. In the basement. Her breath caught in her throat. How long had that been there? Had Michael installed it when he changed the locks? He'd said it was for her safety. A lie. It was for their security. A sudden, desperate thought seized her. She hurried back up the creaking wooden stairs, her heart hammering against her ribs. In the hallway, mounted on the wall, was the sleek white tablet that controlled the smart home. The convenience Michael and Sarah had installed after Richard died. She tapped the screen. Lights, thermostat, security. She went to the security settings. A keypad appeared. Enter PIN to access administrative controls. She typed the code Michael had given her, the one for arming the system at night. Invalid PIN. She tried her birthday. Invalid PIN. She was locked out of her own home's security. She could turn the lights on and off, she could adjust the temperature, but she couldn't see the camera logs, couldn't disable a single sensor. She was a guest user in her own house. Her hands shaking, she went to her old tablet, the one she used for reading news articles and looking at pictures of gardens. She opened her banking app. It had been so convenient, Michael had said. No more paper statements cluttering up the house, no more forgetting to pay a bill. He'd set it all up for her. She tapped in her login information. It logged in, but when she tried to view her detailed transaction history or access the transfer funds menu, a message popped up. For your security, these features have been restricted. Please contact the primary account holder for assistance. The primary account holder. Michael. She sank into an armchair in the living room, the floral pattern seeming to mock her with its cheerfulness. It all clicked into place, the pieces of a puzzle she never knew she was a part of. The fake SPA certificate wasn't a cruel joke. It was a test of her awareness of her compliance. The smart home wasn't for her convenience, it was her warden. The online banking wasn't for simplicity, it was to bleed her dry without her ever seeing the wound. They hadn't just taken over the basement. They had taken over her entire existence piece by digital piece. They had built a cage around her, not with steel bars, but with passwords and PIN codes and user permissions. They were monitoring her, managing her, slowly erasing her, all under the guise of loving, dutiful children, caring for their frail, aging mother. The isolation wasn't a symptom of her grief. It was the architecture of her prison. She sat there for a long time, the silence of the house pressing in on her. The quiet hum she heard now wasn't just the refrigerator. It was the sound of the servers in the basement, the sound of the cameras, the sound of her life being monitored and controlled. She was 75 years old, a widow in a big empty house. Who would believe her? They would see a confused old woman, paranoid, perhaps slipping into dementia, the very narrative her children were so carefully constructing. No. She couldn't fight them from inside the cage. She needed help. Someone from the outside. Someone who knew the world Richard had moved in. A world of secrets and carefully constructed facades. A world her children had apparently inherited. She stood up, a new kind of coldness settling over her. Not dread, but resolve. If this house was a stage, she would give them a performance they would never forget. Her gaze fell on the grand staircase in the entryway. It was Michael's pride and joy, a feature he loved to show off when they had guests. The wood was dark, polished to a high sheen. At the bottom, a small, expensive-looking rug sat on the marble floor. And up in the corner of the ceiling, discreetly placed, was another camera. It had a perfect, unobstructed view. A plan, desperate and dangerous, began to form in her mind. It was a terrible risk, but it was the only one she had. The next morning, she put on a delicate silk blouse and a pair of loose-fitting trousers. She took her time moving with a deliberate frailty she didn't feel. She walked through the house, checking the angles. The camera in the entryway was perfect. It would see everything. She stood at the top of the stairs, her hand resting on the banister. She practiced in her head. A slip, not a tumble. A cry of pain, sharp and believable. A fall that would look bad enough to trigger the system, but not bad enough to truly injure her. She was old, but she wasn't brittle. She knew her body. She could do this. She took a deep breath, walked down the stairs, her steps even and sure. When she reached the third step from the bottom, she paused. This was it. She let her foot slide forward on the polished wood, letting her ankle twist just so. She didn't fight the momentum. She let her body collapse, twisting as she fell, so she would land on her side on the plush rug. As she went down, she let out a cry, a sound torn from her throat that was half acting, half genuine fear of the impact. The landing was a hard jolt, knocking the wind out of her. She lay there, gasping her hip, screaming in protest. For a moment, she wondered if she'd miscalculated. Then a calm, synthesized female voice echoed through the silent house. Fall detected in main entryway, alerting emergency contacts. Silence. Elizabeth lay still, her eyes closed, controlling her breathing. The pain in her hip was real, a sharp, angry throb. Good. That would make the performance more convincing. She waited, each second stretched into an eternity. Was Michael ignoring it? Would he just check the camera feed, see her lying there and dismiss it? The thought sent a spike of pure terror through her. Then her phone lying on the console table in the hall began to ring. Michael's face appeared on the screen. It rang once, twice, 3 times. It went to voicemail. A minute later, it rang again. She didn't move. Let him worry. Let him think she was unconscious. Finally, the ringing stopped. Another minute of agonizing silence passed. Then she heard the distant rising wail of a siren. Relief washed over her so potent it almost made her weep. He had called them. He had to. The system would have created a log, an incident report. Not calling for help would look like negligence. His perfect image was more important than his annoyance. She kept her eyes closed, listening as the ambulance pulled up outside. She heard heavy footsteps on the porch, a firm knock on the door. More silence. Then the sound of a key in the lock. Of course. He'd given them the emergency access code. The door opened. "Ma'am, paramedics, can you hear me?" A man's voice called out. 2 men came into view, one older with a tired, professional demeanor, the other younger with kind eyes and a gentler face. He was the one. She focused on him. I think I fell," she whispered, letting a tremor enter her voice. The younger paramedic knelt beside her. "Okay, Mum, my name is David. We're just going to check you out. Can you tell me your name?" "Elizabeth," she breathed. While the older paramedic began asking standard questions, what happened? Where did it hurt? David gently took her wrist to check her pulse. His touch was warm, steady. This was her chance. Her only chance. With the hand he wasn't holding, she fumbled in the pocket of her trousers, her fingers closing around the small, folded piece of paper she'd placed there that morning. The older paramedic was distracted, talking into his radio. Elizabeth's eyes locked with David's. She gave a tiny, almost imperceptible shake of her head. "Please," she whispered, her voice so low it was barely a sound. She pressed the note into his palm, closing his fingers around it with her own. His eyes widened slightly in surprise, but he didn't pull away. "This is not a medical emergency." She breathed the words, tasting of desperation and hope. "This is a prison. Please, call this number. His name is Frank. Tell him Nightingale needs help." David's expression flickered confusion, then a dawning understanding. He glanced at his partner, who was still occupied. With a deft, practiced movement, he slipped the note into his pocket without a sound. He gave her hand a slight, reassuring squeeze before letting go. It was a gesture that said, "I heard you." A wave of dizziness swept over Elizabeth, the sheer, overwhelming relief of it. She had thrown her message in a bottle into the ocean. Now all she could do was pray it reached the right shore. Frank arrived the next day. There was no chime from the smart doorbell, just a solid old-fashioned knock on the oak door. When she opened it, he stood on her porch, looking just as she remembered him from Richard's funeral, a little heavier, a little more grey, but with the same sharp, assessing eyes that missed nothing. He was a man who had spent a lifetime looking for the truth in rooms full of lies. "Elizabeth," he said, his voice a low rumble. "I got a strange call last night, about a nightingale." She just nodded, her throat tight, and stepped back to let him in. He walked into the entryway, his gaze immediately going to the camera on the ceiling. "Heard you took a tumble," he said, his eyes still on the camera. "I'm a clumsy old woman," she replied, the lie feeling brittle in her mouth. Frank looked at her, then a long, searching look. "You were never clumsy, Elizabeth. You were the most sure-footed person I ever knew." He gestured toward the camera. "Is the whole house wired up like this?" "I believe so." He grunted. "First things first." He went to the smart home tablet in the hall. When the PIN request came up, he pulled a small device from his pocket and plugged it into the port at the bottom. The screen flickered, went black, and then rebooted. He unplugged his device. "They're blind for now. The system will just show a network error if they check. But we don't have forever. So talk to me. Tell me why Richard's code name for you came from a paramedic in the middle of the night." In the quiet of the living room, with the digital eyes of the house now closed, she told him everything. The fake spa certificate, the Instagram post, the locked basement, the computer she couldn't access, the way her finances and her home had been systematically walled off from her. She spoke for nearly an hour, her voice steady, laying out the facts as she knew them. Frank listened without interrupting, his expression growing grimmer with every word. When she finished, he was silent for a long moment, staring into the cold fireplace. "Richard," he said, finally shaking his head. "He was brilliant. A genius at seeing systems, how things connect. I always knew he had projects, things he kept separate. But I never imagined this, that he'd build a cage and his own son would inherit the key. I need proof, Frank. Something more than the fears of a confused old woman." "Then we dig," he said, his voice now all business. Old school. Richard was a digital man, but he came from a paper world. There are always echoes. Where did he keep his old files? Before all this, she thought for a moment. The attic. There are boxes up there that haven't been touched in 20 years. Tax records, old blueprints. The attic was just as she'd left it, hot, dusty, and smelling of aging paper and cedar. They spent hours sifting through brittle manila folders and dusty accordion files. It was tedious, frustrating work. Most of it was exactly what she expected: old household receipts, mortgage documents for the house, Richard's architectural drawings for local businesses. Then Frank grunted. He pulled a thick ledger-style binder from a box labeled Financials 2005-2010. This is before Michael set you up with the online stuff. Right, he asked. She nodded. He opened it on the dusty floor, and they hunched over it. It was a collection of paper bank statements, meticulously filed. He ran his finger down the columns of deposits. Salary from his architecture firm, dividends from stocks, pension deposits. And then he stopped. "What's this?" he said, pointing to a recurring line item, a monthly deposit. Not for a few $1,000s like his salary. This was for 50, 60, sometimes $100,000 every single month. The source was listed as Legacy Architects, Inc. Legacy Architects. Elizabeth said the name feeling cold and alien. I've never heard of it. Richard's firm was Richard Sterling Designs. This isn't his firm, Frank said, his voice low. He flipped through the pages. The payments were like clockwork, year after year, deposited into a specific account. He pulled out another statement, this one for the account the money was being paid into. A few days after each massive deposit, the bulk of the money was wired out. The destination was always the same, a bank in the Cayman Islands. This was a shell corporation, Elizabeth, a laundry. This is where the real money came from. Not from building libraries or designing office parks. Michael's struggling real estate business. It's a front. The family fortune wasn't built. It was washed. The discovery left a sickening void in the pit of her stomach. The life she'd lived, the comfort she'd taken for granted, it was all funded by a lie. A lie Richard had architected, and that Michael was now perpetuating. They went back down to the basement, the sterile office now feeling infinitely more sinister. Frank walked the perimeter of the room, tapping on the walls, his detective's instincts on full alert. A setup this sophisticated doesn't just run on one desktop computer. He muttered, his eyes scanning every inch of the space. He needs processing power. A lot of it. His gaze settled on a large metal air return vent near the floor, one that looked cleaner than the others. He knelt, pulled a multi-tool from his pocket, and undid the screws. He pulled the vent cover away. Behind it, there was no ductwork. There was only darkness and a soft, almost inaudible hum. Frank shone the flashlight from his phone into the space. It wasn't a hidden safe full of documents. It was a cavity, and inside it was a rack of slim black boxes stacked one on top of the other. A silent, blinking constellation of green and amber lights illuminated the space. Thick bundles of black and blue cables snaked from the back of the rack into a conduit that disappeared into the concrete foundation. Servers. Frank breathed a note of awe in his voice. A whole rack of them. They're not just wired into the house, Elizabeth. Look at that conduit. He pointed the light. That's fiber optic. He's wired directly into the city's main trunk line. This isn't a home office. This is a private data center. He reached in, touching one of the units. It was warm, and they're running, silently. Encrypted, I'd bet my pension. Whatever secrets Legacy Architects holds, they're in here. A ghost in the machine. Frank left that evening, promising to find a specialist, a white-hat hacker he trusted, who owed him a favor, someone who could crack the encrypted servers without leaving a trace. He reactivated the cameras before he left, telling her to act normal. To wait. The waiting was the hardest part. Elizabeth was left alone in the house now, hyper-aware of the secrets humming in its foundation and the lies circulating through its digital veins. The house was no longer her home. It was a crime scene. 2 days later, the doorbell chimed. Elizabeth's heart leaped into her throat, thinking it was Frank returning with news. But when she looked at the smart home display, she saw her granddaughter Ava standing on the porch, shifting her weight from one foot to the other. She was holding a Tupperware container, a peace offering, or a surveillance mission. Elizabeth opened the door, forcing a warm smile. Ava, darling, what a surprise. Hi, Grandma, Ava said, offering a small, tentative smile of her own. Mom sent me. She made that lemon loaf you like. She wanted me to, check on you after your fall. That's so thoughtful of her. Elizabeth said the words, tasting like ash. Come in, come in. Ava was 16, poised on the fragile cusp between child and adult. She had Michael's dark hair, but a softness around her eyes that was all her own. In a family of actors, Ava was the only one who seemed incapable of lying. Her emotions were right there on the surface, her anxiety, her uncertainty. As she stepped inside, her eyes scanned the entryway. Are you okay? Dad said you really scared him. Oh, I'm fine, dear. Just a little bump. Your old grandma needs to be more careful. She led the way to the kitchen, taking the container from Ava. Let's have a slice of this. And you can tell me all about school. How are your exams going? They sat in the garden, the late afternoon sun, casting long shadows across the lawn. It was a practiced ritual, one they'd shared for years. But today, everything felt different. Every question, every answer was freighted with a terrible new weight. As Ava talked about school, about a boy she liked, about the stress of applying to colleges, Elizabeth watched her, a profound and painful conflict tearing at her. This was the life she would be destroying. This girl's father was a criminal. Her mother was an accomplice. Her family's wealth was built on a foundation of deceit. Unmasking them would mean detonating a bomb in the center of Ava's world. Her inheritance wouldn't be a fortune. It would be a scandal. It's just a lot, Ava said, pushing a stray strand of hair from her face. She was quiet for a moment, staring at the rose bushes Elizabeth so carefully tended. The pressure. You know, to get the right grades, to get into the right school, to make sure all my pictures on Instagram look perfect. She gave a short, bitter laugh. Mum checks my posts, to make sure they have the right family brand. Happy. Successful. Perfect. Elizabeth felt a cold pang in her chest. Ava looked at her, then her young face troubled. Sometimes I feel like we're all just acting grandma, like we're in a play and everyone has a part. Dad has to be the successful son, Mom has to be the perfect hostess, Chloe has to be the artistic one. And I have to be the good daughter who never messes up. She picked at a loose thread on her jeans. It's exhausting. I saw Mum's post about your spa day, the one from the resort. Her eyes met Elizabeth's, and in them Elizabeth saw a flicker of the family's shared terrible knowledge. She spent an hour trying to get the right photo of the sunset. It had to look spontaneous. The simple, honest confession struck Elizabeth with the force of a physical blow. Ava knew. She might not know the details, the servers in the basement or the shell corporations, but she knew the core of it. She knew it was all a performance, and she was suffocating in it. Elizabeth reached across the small table and placed her hand over her granddaughter's. Ava's skin was warm, her hand so small. This was her greatest obstacle, the final, most painful turn of the screw. To free herself, she had to sacrifice her granddaughter's innocence. To seek justice, she had to shatter this child's life. Could she do it? Could she look into these honest, troubled eyes and choose her own freedom over Ava's fragile peace? The love she felt for Ava was the last pure, untainted thing in her life. And it was now the strongest bar on her cage. She looked from Ava's face to the house looming behind them, the house that held all its dark secrets, and she felt herself torn in two. The air in the basement was thick with the hum of machinery and the smell of dust and cold electricity. It was a sterile, alien environment, a world away from the sun-drenched roses in her garden. Frank had made a call. An hour later, A man named Leo arrived carrying a battered laptop bag and looking more like a tired university professor than a master of digital espionage. He didn't say much, just nodded at Elizabeth, his eyes taking in the server racks with a kind of weary professional interest. Richard built a fortress, Leo murmured, plugging a tangle of cables into his laptop and then into a port on the main server. Military-grade encryption, commercial stuff on the outside, but the core, this is bespoke. Nasty. Frank stood with his arms crossed, a granite statue of impatience. Can you get in? Leo's fingers flew across his keyboard, the clatter echoing in the silence. Getting in isn't a single event, it's a siege. We knock on the front door, see how it responds. We check the windows. We see if he left a key under the mat. Metaphorically speaking. He glanced at Elizabeth. This will take time, ma'am. We're trying to pick a lock designed by a ghost. Elizabeth sat on a hard metal stool Frank had found for her, her hands clasped in her lap. She felt strangely calm. The rage from the day before had cooled into a hard, dense core in her chest. She was no longer a victim stumbling in the dark. She was a spectator at the exhumation of her own life. She would wait. She had been waiting for a year, for decades, without even knowing it. What were a few more hours? Hours bled into one another. Frank paced. Leo muttered to himself, his screen a cascade of incomprehensible text. Elizabeth watched, marking time by the subtle shifts in the hum of the servers, the way the light from Leo's laptop painted his face in shifting patterns of green and white. Frank ordered pizza. They ate it in silence, the cardboard box resting on a server casing that felt cool to the touch. It was long after midnight when Leo finally leaned back, a soft "ah" escaping his lips. Got a loose thread. He said it so quietly Elizabeth almost missed it. He got arrogant. He built a beautiful, impenetrable wall, but he used a public-facing subroutine for a diagnostic tool, a common one. He probably thought no one would ever get physical access to the machine. He was counting on this room staying locked forever. Frank leaned in. What does that mean, Leo? It means I can see the file structure. Leo said, his voice gaining energy. Still encrypted, but I can see the names, the architecture. And I can start running decryption sequences on individual directories instead of the whole damn thing at once. It's the difference between trying to bulldoze a skyscraper and just taking it apart brick by brick. He pointed to the screen. A list of folders appeared, their names, clinical and corporate. Client portfolios, financials, active projects, archived, and one that made Elizabeth's breath catch. Legacy Architects, Inc. That's it, Frank said, his voice a low growl. That's the name on the offshore statements. Let's start there, Leo said. This is the big one. It'll take a while to unpack. The bricks began to come loose. The first one was a client file, a billionaire real estate developer in New York. The file contained what looked like a standard corporate espionage report. But then Leo decrypted a subfolder labeled Deliverable. On the screen, a video played. It was grainy shot from a hidden camera in what looked like a hotel room. The developer's main rival was on the video, a man with a wife and 4 children, seen accepting a briefcase from a woman who looked far too young. It was damning. It was also completely, utterly fake. My God, Elizabeth whispered. Leo's face was grim. It's a deep fake. A good one for its time. But look at the artifacts around the edges of his face. And the audio is looped. They didn't just ruin this man. They built the weapon that did it. He clicked another file. It was a digital receipt, a payment of $2 million from the developer to Legacy Architects. They fell into a sickening rhythm. Leo would crack a file, and a new piece of the puzzle would slam into place, each one uglier than the last. They found a forged digital will, disinheriting the children of a shipping magnate in favor of a new, much younger wife. The will was accompanied by fabricated emails and text messages from the magnate to his lawyer complaining about his ungrateful children. They even found the raw data used to mimic his typing style, his cadence, his signature. They found manufactured online histories. A politician's son with a history of DUIs was given a new identity complete with a fake university degree, a glowing LinkedIn profile, and a social media presence full of volunteer work and charity marathons. The real history was scrubbed from the internet, erased, as if it had never happened. Legacy architects didn't just launder money, they laundered reality. This is, Frank struggled for the word, monstrous. Emails and internal chat logs, now decrypted, laid out the corporate structure with chilling clarity. Richard was the visionary, the architect. His name was all over the project proposals, the grand designs for these intricate deceptions. He was the one who invented the methods, the artist. Michael was the technician. His logs were filled with code notes on rendering times, software patches, and hardware upgrades. He was the one who built the tools, who operated the machinery in this very basement. Elizabeth remembered him as a boy, taking apart radios and putting them back together. He hadn't changed. He had just scaled up. The pride she'd once felt now tasted like ash in her mouth. And then there was Sarah. Her name was in the client-facing documents. Client relations. Project broker. She was the one who met the billionaires and the criminals. She negotiated the prices. She managed the accounts. An email from her to Richard was particularly stark. Client is hesitant about the price point for the political takedown. I reminded him that reputations are fragile, and we are the only ones who can guarantee a clean break. He will wire the funds by morning. Her tone was crisp, confident, and utterly ruthless. Elizabeth felt a wave of nausea. This house, this life, the private school for the kids, the European vacations, the expensive cars. It wasn't built on stocks or smart investments. It was built on the ruins of other people's lives. It was funded by blackmail and lies of fortune spun from digital poison. Richard hadn't just been a successful man with a secret hobby. He had been a kingpin, and her children were not his victims. They were his apprentices, his heirs. There's more. Leo said, his voice softer now, hesitant. He was looking at her, not the screen. There's another directory. It's different. The encryption is another level up, walled off from the client data. What's it called? Frank asked. Leo swallowed. He seemed reluctant to say it. It's called Project Nightingale. The name hit Elizabeth like a physical blow. Nightingale. It was Richard's private name for her from the early days of their courtship. He said her voice was like a song in the quiet of the evening. He'd whisper it to her in the dark. It was a word of intimacy, a relic of a love she had believed in. To see it here on this cold screen as a folder name in a den of criminals was a violation that cut deeper than any other. "Open it," she said. Her voice was a shard of glass. "Elizabeth, maybe we should take a break," Frank suggested gently. "Open it, Leo." She repeated, her eyes locked on the screen. Leo's fingers went back to work. This time the process was slower, more complex. He muttered about layered security keys, biometric locks, that Michael had tried to bypass with code. It was a vault within a vault. Elizabeth didn't move. She just watched the progress bar crawl across the screen, a tiny green line separating her from the final, ugliest truth. Finally, a click. The folder opened. It was empty at first, just a few subfolders. The first was labeled Medical. Leo opened it. Inside were dozens of PDF files, scans of medical reports. They were on the letterhead of a prominent geriatric specialist in Portland. Elizabeth had never met this man in her life. The reports chronicled in cold clinical detail a steady and progressive mental decline. Her decline. Patient exhibits signs of early onset dementia. One report from 3 years ago read, memory lapses, confusion regarding time and place, mild paranoia. Patient's condition has worsened, read another from 18 months ago. Episodes of emotional dysregulation, inability to manage complex financial matters is now apparent. The most recent one, dated just 2 months ago, was the worst. Recommends immediate consideration of assisted living and legal guardianship to ensure patient's safety and well-being. Patient is no longer competent to make her own medical or financial decisions. They were all signed by the doctor. And at the bottom of the folder was a file containing bank statements, monthly payments disguised as consulting fees, from legacy architects to a private corporation owned by that same doctor. He hadn't been diagnosing her. He had been bribed to condemn her. They were building a case. Frank breathed, his face pale with fury. All this time, they were building a legal case to have you declared incompetent. The next folder was labeled Audio Surveillance. It was full of sound files, time-stamped. Leo clicked on one from the previous winter. Her own voice filled the basement, but it was wrong, hesitant, broken. I can't find the thing for the, you know. There was a long, confused pause. Then Michael's voice, patient, condescending. The remote, Mom. It's right here in your hand. But Elizabeth remembered that day. She remembered it with perfect clarity. She had been dizzy from the flu, her head pounding. She'd asked for the thermometer. I can't find the thermometer, Michael. For my temperature, you know. He'd brought it to her, but he'd been recording. They had cut the audio apart, splicing her flu-induced fumbling into the speech of a senile old woman. They had taken her physical vulnerability and edited it into a portrait of mental decay. Play the next one, she said, her voice devoid of emotion. It was a clip of her on the phone with Chloe, talking about a book she was reading. They had inserted long, unnatural pauses, making her sound like she was losing her train of thought. They had amplified the sound of her breathing, making her sound frail, exhausted. The final folder was the most invasive of all. Behavioral monitoring. It contained logs from the smart home security system, timestamps, locations, and annotations. 7:14 a.m. Subject enters kitchen, opens refrigerator, closes it, opens it again. Pacing, indecisive behavior. 2:32 p.m. Subject in living room, standing in front of window for 11 minutes, unresponsive to external stimuli. Elizabeth remembered that moment. She had been watching a hummingbird at the feeder, mesmerized. They had logged it as a catatonic state. 9:47 p.m. Subject attempts to go down to basement, tests door, fails, returns upstairs. Note, agitation and obsession with locked areas is a common symptom. They had been watching her every move. Every sigh, every moment of quiet contemplation, every lapse in memory, real or imagined, had been catalogued, twisted, and weaponized. They weren't just hiding their father's crimes. They were building a new one brick by brick, lie by lie. They were constructing a prison for her mind, a legal cage from which there would be no escape. And the name they gave this monstrous project, Nightingale. It wasn't a term of endearment. It was the name of the bird they intended to put in a cage. Her grief, her sense of betrayal was so immense, it passed beyond tears. It settled into something cold and heavy, a deep, abiding certainty. Her children were not just flawed or greedy, they were predators, and she was their prey. There's one more file, Leo said, his voice quiet. Inside this folder, it's a video file. The name is The Rehearsal. Play it, Elizabeth commanded. The screen flickered, and her own face stared back at her. But it wasn't her. It was a version of her from a nightmare. Her hair was messy, her eyes wide and lost. A shawl was draped over her shoulders, her hands trembling as she held a pen. She was sitting at the dining room table, the one where they had shared so many family meals. Michael stood beside her, his hand on her shoulder, his expression a mask of gentle concern. "Just sign here, Mom," the video version of Michael said. "It's just to let me help you with the bills. Nothing to worry about." The camera zoomed in as the frail hand of the woman who looked exactly like Elizabeth scrawled a shaky signature on a document. The document was a full, irrevocable power of attorney granting Michael complete control over her entire estate, including the house. The video was flawless. The lighting, the sounds of the house, the weary sadness in her own eyes. It was perfect. For a terrifying second, Elizabeth felt a sliver of doubt. Had this happened? Had she forgotten? "It's a deep fake," Leo said, snapping her out of it. "The most sophisticated one on this server. This is their masterpiece, the checkmate." He typed furiously. But they got sloppy. They rendered the final video, but they saved the project file in the same directory. They must have been in a hurry. Or maybe they were just arrogant. He clicked his mouse. "Here's the source footage, the rehearsal." The screen changed. The warm, familiar dining room was gone, replaced by a sterile studio walls covered in green fabric. In the center of the room stood a woman, a stranger, thin and wiry, wearing a black suit covered in small white dots, a motion capture suit. Her face was bare, her hair pulled back. She was practicing Elizabeth's signature on a tablet. Then a voice came from off-camera. It was Sarah. Her voice was not the warm, cheerful tone she used in public. It was sharp, clinical, impatient. No, that's not right," Sarah snapped. "Your hand needs to tremble more. Think of her arthritis. It's a tremor born of weakness, not nerves. Try it again." The actress sighed and tried again, her hand shaking dramatically. "Better," Sarah said. "Now the head. Tilt your head, like you're trying to remember where you are but can't quite manage it. A little to the left. Yes, like that. Vacant. That's the look we want. Lost." The camera panned slightly, and Elizabeth's heart stopped. Chloe. Her daughter Chloe was standing near the edge of the set, holding 2 cups of coffee. She looked pale and nervous, her eyes darting everywhere except the camera or the actress. She was chewing on her lower lip. She wasn't directing. She wasn't in charge. But she was there. She was fetching the coffee. She was watching it happen, a silent, willing accomplice to the digital murder of her own mother's identity. Sarah's voice cut through the air again, coaching the actress on Elizabeth's voice. "It needs to be breathier, more fragile." She gets confused mid-sentence. "So you'll say, 'Is this for the—' and then you'll just trail off. Look to Michael for help. Make him your anchor. The audience for this needs to believe you are utterly dependent on him." The actress nodded. "Okay. Is this for the—" She let her voice fade her face, a perfect mask of bewildered fragility. "Perfect?" Sarah said, a note of triumph in her voice. "Absolutely perfect. Michael will be thrilled." Leo switched off the video. The basement was silent again, save for the hum of the servers, which now sounded like the breathing of a great sleeping beast. Frank let out a long, slow breath. "They weren't just his accomplices," he said, his voice thick with disgust. "They were his star pupils. They took everything their father taught them and pointed it right at you." Elizabeth stared at the blank screen, but she could still see it. The actress in the suit. Sarah's cold, calculating direction, and Chloe, hovering at the edges with her cups of coffee, radiating guilt and complicity. The love she had for her children, a vast and resilient thing that had survived so much, finally died in that cold basement. It didn't fade away. It was murdered. And in its place, something new and hard and powerful began to grow. It was the weapon they had just handed her. She stood up from the stool, her back straight, her hands no longer trembling. "Thank you, Leo," she said, her voice clear and steady. "You've given me everything I need." Frank looked at her, his eyes searching hers. He saw the change. The grief was still there, a shadow behind her eyes, but the fire in front of it was brighter. "What now, Elizabeth?" "Now," she said, turning toward the stairs. "Now I set a trap of my own." The next 2 days were a blur of quiet preparation. Frank and Leo made copies of everything, uploading the most critical files to a secure, anonymous cloud server. They wiped the logs of their own access, making the basement fortress seem untouched once more. Frank re-enabled the internal cameras, but not before giving Elizabeth a small, powerful signal jammer. "It'll create a 5-minute dead zone," he'd explained. "Use it when you need to, but only when you absolutely need to." Then she waited. She tended her roses. She read her book. She moved through her house no longer a prisoner, but a warden studying her own prison before the inmates returned. Every camera was an ally now. Every condescending text message from her children, asking if she was doing okay on her own, was another piece of evidence. On the third day, she heard the crunch of tires on the gravel driveway. The sound of the front door opening, a burst of loud, cheerful voices flooding the quiet hall. They were home. Michael, Sarah, and Chloe swept in on a tide of expensive luggage and duty-free shopping bags. They were tanned, glowing with the self-satisfied health of a luxury vacation. "Mom, we're home," Chloe chirped, rushing to give her a kiss on the cheek that felt as cold as the basement air. "You look well," Michael said, setting his bag down. He smiled, his broad, handsome smile, the one that used to make her heart swell with pride. Now it just looked like a mask. "Did you enjoy your rest? How was the spa day?" Sarah asked, not even looking at her as she scrolled through her phone. "I told them to give you the deluxe package. You deserve a bit of pampering." Elizabeth allowed a frail, tired smile to touch her lips. She let her shoulders slump. She played the part they had written for her. "Oh, it was very nice. A little overwhelming. I mostly just slept." "Of course you did," Sarah said, patting her arm. "That's what you need. Rest." They chatted on about their trip. The infinity pool, the Michelin-starred restaurant, the hilarious sunburn Chloe got. Elizabeth listened, nodding, making soft, vague sounds of agreement. She was a ghost in her own living room, and they were utterly oblivious. That evening, after a dinner, they insisted on ordering in because she shouldn't have to cook. Michael sat beside her on the sofa. He took her hand. His touch was soft, but his grip felt like a shackle. "Mom," he began, his voice taking on a serious, gentle tone, the same tone from the deepfake video. "We need to talk. We've been doing a lot of thinking on this trip. About you. About the future." Sarah sat opposite them, her phone finally put away. She leaned forward, her face a carefully constructed mask of empathy. "We love you so much, Elizabeth. And because we love you, we have to be honest. This house, it's just too much for you now. We worry constantly." Michael continued, squeezing her hand. "What if you fall again? What if there's a fire? You're all alone here." Chloe sat on the edge of an armchair, twisting a napkin in her hands. "We just want you to be safe, Mum." Elizabeth looked from one face to the next. The concerned son, the caring daughter-in-law, the worried daughter. A perfect tableau of familial devotion. It was a masterpiece of a performance. But she had seen the rehearsal. "So," Michael said, taking a deep breath as if steeling himself to deliver difficult news. "We've made a decision. Out of love. We've found the most wonderful assisted living facility. It's beautiful. Gardens, activities, 24-hour care. The best. And I've already spoken to a realtor." Sarah added a little too quickly. "Just preliminarily, of course. But the market in Willow Creek is on fire. People are desperate for a house with this kind of character. We could get it sold before the summer's over. We've scheduled a meeting," Michael said, delivering the final line. For tomorrow evening, with the family lawyer, just to go over the paperwork and make the transition as smooth as possible for you. They all looked at her, waiting for the tears, the confusion, the weary acceptance they had practiced for. Elizabeth looked down at Michael's hand on hers. She looked at Sarah's eager face. She looked at Chloe's guilty, downcast eyes. The trap was set. They had walked right into it, their hearts full of greed, and their minds blinded by arrogance. She gave Michael's hand a small, frail pat. A lawyer? She said, her voice a soft, wispy thing. Oh, I see. If you think it's for the best, dear. Relief washed over their faces. It was that easy. She was exactly as broken as they had designed her to be. Michael smiled, triumphant and loving. It is for the best, Mom. You'll see. Elizabeth looked up at him, and for a fraction of a second the mask slipped. Her eyes were not lost or confused. They were clear, cold, and sharp as a surgeon's scalpel. He didn't notice. None of them did. They were already celebrating their victory. But the performance wasn't over. The final act was about to begin, and she was no longer the subject. She was the director. The evening air hung thick and still, the kind of quiet that precedes a storm. In the living room, the air was even heavier, saturated with the scent of lilies, a cloying funereal perfume from a bouquet Sarah had brought, and the faint, sharp smell of Peterson's expensive cologne. He was a man made of polished surfaces, gleaming shoes, a watch that caught the lamplight, and a smile that never quite reached his eyes. He sat opposite Elizabeth, his leather briefcase resting by his feet like a loyal dog. Michael sat beside his wife, his posture stiff, a man playing a role he'd rehearsed too many times. He kept clearing his throat, his eyes darting towards his mother, then away as if her presence was a light too bright to look at directly. Sarah, however, was in her element. She leaned forward, her hands clasped a study in compassionate concern. Every gesture was soft, every word coated in sugar. Only Chloe, perched on the edge of the ottoman, seemed genuinely frayed. Her hands twisted a loose thread on her jeans, her face pale and strained. She wouldn't meet Elizabeth's gaze. Elizabeth let them have the silence for a moment longer. She sat in her usual armchair, the one Richard had always claimed was his. Tonight, it felt like a throne. She allowed her hands to tremble slightly as she reached for the glass of water on the side table. Her movements were deliberately slow, frail. She let her gaze seem distant, unfocused, as if trying to piece together thoughts that kept scattering like dust. She had spent the last 24 hours practicing this. The vacant stare, the whisper of a voice, the faint, confused frown. She had to be the woman they had invented. The woman from Project Nightingale. Mom. Michael started his voice too loud in the quiet room. Are you comfortable? Elizabeth blinked slowly, turning her head towards him. Michael, she said, her voice a papery rustle. Yes, I'm here. Sarah placed a gentle hand on Michael's arm, a silent command to let her take the lead. Elizabeth. She began, her tone the one a person uses for a frightened animal or a small child. We're so glad we could all be together tonight. We have some wonderful news, something we're all very excited about. Elizabeth just looked at her, her expression one of mild, polite confusion. She watched the way Sarah's perfectly manicured nails tapped a gentle rhythm on her own knee. She saw the predatory focus in her daughter-in-law's eyes, thinly veiled by a performance of love. We know things have been difficult for you lately. Sarah continued, her voice dipping into a lower, more intimate register. This big house, the memories? It's a lot for anyone to handle alone. We worry about you. Constantly. She paused, letting the weight of their supposed worry fill the room. Peterson, the lawyer, gave a solemn, professional nod. So we've done some research, Sarah said, her smile widening. Michael and I and Chloe, we've all been working together on this because we love you and we want what's best for you. Elizabeth's eyes flickered to Chloe, who flinched and looked down at her lap, her jaw tight. A pang of something cold and sharp went through Elizabeth, but she pushed it down. This was not the time for pity. We've found the most wonderful place for you, Elizabeth, Sarah announced, her voice brimming with false excitement. It's called the Willows. It's more like a resort than, well, you know. It has beautiful gardens activities, incredible medical staff on call 24/7. You wouldn't have to worry about a thing. No more bills, no more cooking, no more lonely nights. It's safe, Mom, Michael chimed in, leaning forward. That's the most important thing. Your safety. We saw the alert from your fall. It terrified us. We can't let something like that happen again. The fall. Her performance at the bottom of the stairs. The key that had unlocked everything. Elizabeth had to suppress a smile. They were handing her the script, and all she had to do was read her lines. A place? She asked, her voice trembling just enough. But this is my home. Of course it is, darling, Sarah soothed. And it always will be in your heart. But we have to be practical. As your primary caregiver, Michael has to consider your long-term well-being. And Mr. Peterson is here just to help us with the paperwork, to make the transition smooth and stress-free. Peterson cleared his throat, opening his briefcase. Indeed, Elizabeth, he said, his voice smooth as oil. The documents are quite standard. Given your recent episodes and Michael's concern for your health and financial security, he will be assuming full power of attorney. It's a formality, really. It just allows him to manage your affairs and ensure your assets are used exclusively for your care at the Willows. It protects you. He slid a sheaf of papers across the coffee table. On top was a signature line with her name typed neatly beneath it. Elizabeth stared at the papers, her mind perfectly clear, but she let her eyes glaze over. She saw it all with a chilling lucidity. The cage finely crafted and presented as a sanctuary. The legal chains disguised as a blanket of security. They had thought of everything. They had built the narrative, cast her as the feeble-minded matriarch, and were now staging the final act of her dispossession. Sarah's voice was a gentle murmur. It's for the best, Elizabeth. Truly. We all agree. We just want you to be happy and safe. Elizabeth looked up from the papers. She looked past Sarah, past Chloe's tear-streaked, guilty face. She looked directly at her son, her brilliant, technical, hollowed-out son. The boy who used to build worlds with Legos and now built prisons with code. For a long moment, she held his gaze. She let the mask of confusion fall away. It didn't drop dramatically. It simply dissolved like mist burning off in the morning sun. Her back straightened in the chair. The tremor in her hand vanished. Her eyes, which had been clouded and distant, became piercingly clear. A sharp, intelligent light ignited in them, a light Michael hadn't seen in years and had assumed was extinguished forever. The shift was so total, so absolute, that the air in the room seemed to crackle. Sarah's smile faltered. Michael's brow furrowed in genuine confusion. Elizabeth's voice, when she finally spoke, was not the frail whisper of before. It was steady calm and resonant, with an authority that had been dormant for decades. "Tell me, son," she said, her tone level almost conversational. "The deep fake you made of me signing the power of attorney, the one you were planning to use if I refused tonight." She let the words hang in the air, each one a perfectly polished stone dropped into a silent pool. "Did you use the same rendering software Dad used for the senator's fake heart attack video? Or did you upgrade to something more sophisticated? I know Richard always complained about the latency on the old system." Silence. It wasn't a quiet silence. It was a roar. A deafening, crushing absence of sound that sucked all the air from the room. Michael's face, which had been a mask of strained sincerity, shattered. The blood drained from it, leaving behind a waxy grey pallor. His mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. He looked like a man who had just seen a ghost walk through the wall, the ghost of a secret he thought was buried 6 feet under. Sarah froze her hand, hovering in mid-air, where it had been about to pat Elizabeth's arm. Her face cycled through a series of expressions too quickly to read disbelief, confusion, and then a dawning, sickening horror. Her mask of compassion cracked, and for a second, the raw, furious avarice beneath was visible. Chloe let out a choked sob, a sound like a small animal in a trap. She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking violently. Peterson, the lawyer, looked from Elizabeth to Michael, and back again, his professional composure evaporating. He blinked rapidly, his polished smile gone replaced by a look of utter bewilderment. His gaze darted towards his briefcase, as if it might contain an explanation for this impossible turn of events. Before any of them could form a word, before the paralysis broke, Elizabeth calmly reached for the small remote control on the side table. It was not the remote for the television. Frank had programmed it for her this morning. With a simple, deliberate press of a button, the large screen mounted on the living room wall flickered to life. For a moment, the screen showed a familiar scene, Elizabeth, or a version of her, sitting in this very living room. She looked frail, her hands trembling as she held a pen over a document. Her voice, thin and reedy, could be heard. Yes, of course, Michael. Whatever you think is best." The camera zoomed in as the pen scrawled a shaky signature on the power of attorney papers. The very papers, now sitting on the coffee table. Peterson, seeing something he recognized, began to recover. He straightened his tie, a flicker of his smug confidence returning. He nodded approvingly at the screen. "Well?" He began, his voice still a little shaky. "As you can see, this is merely a precaution, a record of her consent." But his voice trailed off as Elizabeth pressed the button again. The screen split. On the left, the deepfake video continued to play in a silent loop. On the right, a new scene appeared. The footage was raw, time-stamped from 3 weeks prior. It showed a studio stark and brightly lit. In the center of the room stood a woman in a grey motion capture suit dotted with sensors. Her face was a perfect blank. But standing next to her, gesturing emphatically, was Sarah. Sarah's voice, sharp and stripped of all its feigned warmth, filled the room. No, that's not right," she commanded. "The tremor in your hand needs to be less consistent. Make it look authentic, like you're fighting the confusion." The actress nodded and practiced signing her name in the air with a palsied, jerking motion. And the voice. Sarah's recorded voice continued cold and precise. "It needs to tremble more. Add a little catch right here." She tapped her own throat. "Like you're about to forget your own name. Try it again." The camera panned slightly, and there, sitting in a chair just out of the main action, was Chloe. She wasn't participating, but she was there. Her head was down, staring at her phone, a silent, willing accomplice to the meticulous construction of her mother's demise. The living room was a tableau of ruin. Michael had slumped back into the couch, his face ashen, his eyes wide and vacant. He looked utterly broken, a marionette with its strings cut. Sarah was on her feet, her face a contorted mask of pure, undiluted rage. The illusion was gone, burned away by the truth on the screen, and what was left was terrifying in its intensity. Elizabeth turned her calm, cool gaze from the screen to the lawyer. "Is that legally binding, Mr. Peterson?" she asked, her voice as soft as silk and as sharp as glass. "Does the state of Oregon recognize rehearsals as consent?" For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then, with a guttural snarl, Sarah lunged. She didn't go for Elizabeth. She went for the remote control on the table, her hands clawing a final desperate attempt to reclaim control, to plunge them all back into darkness. Her fingers had just brushed the edge of the table when the front door burst open with such force that it slammed against the hallway wall. Frank stood on the threshold. He wasn't smiling. His face was grim, set like granite, but in his eyes was the profound, weary satisfaction of a long hunt finally concluded. Behind him, flanking the doorway, stood two uniformed police officers. Their presence was so sudden, so incongruous in the tastefully decorated living room, that it felt like a tear in the fabric of reality. Sarah froze, her body twisted in her lunge, her face turned towards the door. All the fight seemed to drain out of her at once, replaced by a stark, animal fear. One of the officers stepped forward, his eyes scanning the room and landing on Michael, then Sarah. His voice was calm, professional, and utterly devoid of emotion. It was the voice of consequence. Michael Miller and Sarah Miller. He said the names dropping into the silence like stones into a well. You're under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud, grand theft, and illegal surveillance. The illusion didn't just shatter. It exploded. The sound of Chloe's wailing became a high, piercing scream. Michael didn't move, but silent tears began to stream down his face, tracing paths through his shock. The second officer moved past Frank, his hand already on his handcuffs. He approached Sarah, who finally found her voice. It was not the sweet, caring tone she had perfected. It was a venomous hiss. "You bitch!" She spat at Elizabeth, her face ugly with hate. "You senile old bitch, you've ruined everything." The officer took her arm firmly. "Mum, you have the right to remain silent." He began his voice a flat monotone as he clicked the first cuff around her wrist. The sound of the metal ratchet was the only sound in the room, sharp and final. It was the sound of a lock turning, the sound of a cage door swinging shut. The perfect family, the beautiful house, the carefully constructed lie, all of it dissolved in that single metallic click. All that was left was the sordid, ugly truth exposed under the harsh glare of the law, while Elizabeth sat on her throne, watching the wreckage of the world her husband had built and her children had tried to inherit be swept away. A year can erase a house, but not its memory. The grand home in Willow Creek was sold within a month, its contents auctioned off its walls, stripped bare. A new family lived there now, a young couple with loud children and no ghosts in the basement. For Elizabeth, the house was a phantom limb. She knew it was gone, but sometimes she still felt the ache of it. The Legacy Architects scandal had been a 9-day wonder, a flash of lurid fascination for the national news cycle. It had everything wealth technology, a secret criminal enterprise masquerading as a family business, and the betrayal of a vulnerable mother. The media called Elizabeth the nightingale who sang, a moniker she despised. It made her sound like a victim who got lucky. She knew she had been a warrior who went to war. The legal fallout had been swift and brutal. With the evidence from the servers, the client lists, the financial records, the raw footage of their various fabrications, Michael and Sarah had no defense. They were sentenced to 7 to 10 years in a federal facility. Their mugshots, pale and stripped of all pretense, had been everywhere. Michael, the brilliant technician, and Sarah, the charming broker, reduced to numbers in a system. Chloe, through a torrent of tears and a plea bargain, had received 5 years of probation. Her complicity had been passive, her guilt profound. She wrote letters to Elizabeth, long rambling apologies filled with self-loathing and regret. Elizabeth read the first one and then stopped. Forgiveness was a currency she no longer dealt in, and Ava. That was the wound that had not healed. She was living with Sarah's sister in another state, enrolled in a new school, trying to stitch together a new life from the tatters of the old one. They spoke on the phone, sometimes brief, stilted conversations that danced around the gaping chasm between them. Elizabeth would hear the pain in her granddaughter's voice and know that this was the true cost of her freedom. Some cages once broken leave behind scars on everyone. Elizabeth now lived in a small apartment in a town on the Oregon coast she'd chosen from a map. The place was barely 2 rooms, but its single large window looked out over the endless churning grey of the Pacific Ocean. The air smelled of salt and rain, a clean, wild scent that scoured the last traces of Willow Creek's cloying lilies from her memory. She owned a few books, a comfortable chair, a warm blanket. After a lifetime of accumulating things, she found a strange liberation in possessing almost nothing. Her days were quiet. She walked on the beach, letting the wind whip at her coat, watching the gulls wheel and cry overhead. She read. She cooked simple meals. She was not happy, not in the way a young person understands the word. Happiness felt like a loud colour, and her world was now painted in muted, sombre shades of grey-blue and white. But she was at peace. It was a quiet, profound peace, the kind that settles in the bones after a long fever has broken. One afternoon, a letter arrived. It was not from Chloe. The envelope was plain, the handwriting unfamiliar. She opened it with a flicker of curiosity. The letter was from a woman in California. Her name was Maria. She wrote that her father, a respected local politician, had taken his own life 15 years ago after a fabricated video surfaced showing him accepting a bribe. His career was ruined, his name, disgraced, his family, shattered. He had sworn his innocence until the very end, but no one believed him. The police, acting on the evidence Elizabeth had provided from the Legacy Architects servers, had reopened the case. They had found the original files, the raw footage, the invoices from Richard Miller. Her father's name had been officially and publicly cleared. "It's too late for him," the letter read. "But it's not too late for us, his children. You didn't just expose your family's crimes. You gave us back our father. You gave us back the truth. I don't know how to thank you for that." Elizabeth folded the letter carefully and placed it on the windowsill. She looked out at the ocean. The waves rolled in one after another, crashing on the shore and retreating, a relentless, eternal rhythm of collapse and return. She thought of Richard, the architect of it all. She thought of Michael and Sarah, his apprentices now imprisoned by the same kind of walls they had tried to build around her. She thought of Ava, adrift. She thought of a man she had never met, whose good name was now restored, a small point of light reclaimed from a universe of darkness. She wasn't a hero. She wasn't a symbol. She was a survivor. And as she watched the sun dip below the horizon, painting the clouds in shades of bruised purple and gold, she felt the profound, sombre peace of a woman who had walked through fire and emerged on the other side not unmarked, but finally irrevocably in possession of her own story.